First of all, welcome everybody. If anyone doesn't know who I am, I'm Julian Boulding. I'm the founder of the Network One. And for more than 15 years, we've been helping and working with independent agency leaders all over the world to succeed in a competitive environment, but probably never as tough an environment as it is today. So we're really, really excited to see lots of people here. Apologies for a few minutes technical problem just now, getting people in with the right password, but we're up and running now, glad to say. Just a quick introduction. 3 weeks from today, in the middle of May, we were due to hold our event of the year, which is our Indie Summit. And like everybody else, you know, we were disrupted. We can't hold the summit. And we thought, what should we do? So what we've decided to do is to launch a series of webinars with many of the speakers from the Indie Summit who will be giving their time. We hope that it will be as exciting a version of the Indie Summit as we can possibly get while online. We've had a large number of people registering, almost 300 independent agency leaders from around the world. And, you know, while we know that not everybody who registers can come, I just wanted, before we start, just welcome everybody by country because it's quite an impressive list. So I shall take a deep breath and here we go. We have people, hopefully now, from Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Bulgaria, Cambodia, Canada, China, Chile, Costa Rica, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Ethiopia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hong Kong, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, India, Kenya, Japan, Jordan, Mexico, Namibia, Netherlands, Nigeria, North Macedonia, Norway, Peru, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Russia, Singapore, Slovakia, Spain, South Africa, Sudan, Switzerland, Taiwan, Turkey, UK, USA, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe. And I think that is the biggest number of people that I have ever had at the same time in my spare bedroom. So welcome everybody. And without more ado, Stephanie Fox, my colleague, is going to introduce each of these seminars, and we'll ask her now. Stephanie, please say a few words of introduction and instruction, and then hand over to our speaker of today. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. So as Julian mentioned, my name is Stephanie Fox and I will be moderating this webinar. We're really grateful that you've tuned into our first ever webinar Wednesday. The rest of the team is also on this call. So we've got Julian, Paul Squirrel and Lizzie Gold. So just some housekeeping before I introduce our speaker. I'm going to post these in the chat box, but I'll go through them quickly now. So with timings wise, we'll have a 5-minute intro, then we're going to have 35 minutes of presentation, 15 minutes of Q&A, and we'll finish by 1:55 BST London time, so you can be ready for your next virtual appointment. Please keep your microphones muted at all times. We'll unmute your microphone if we're calling on you to ask a question. That being said, we would appreciate it if you could keep your videos on so Sean has some friendly faces to present to. There'll be a Q&A portion at the end, as I mentioned, but if you have any questions in the meantime, please send them to me directly in the chat. So to do this, go to your chat box where it says to, you should see a drop-down menu. So instead of everyone, select Stephanie Fox. We'll go through all of the questions and we'll select a few to ask Sean once he's finished speaking. All questions should be sent to me in the chat box. If you'd like to ask the question to Sean yourself, please type in brackets, I'll ask, or something to this effect next to your question in the chat box. I'll then call on you to ask your question during the Q&A, so do stay online. If you prefer for me to ask Sean your question, please say so in the brackets next to your question. So you should hopefully have your Zoom viewing mode set to speaker view. If not, just click speaker view at the top right of your screen. Our speaker, Sean Pillot de Chenecy, will be sharing slides on his screen. If you can't see his speaker window when his slides are on, select show active speaker video. If you have any technical issues, please message Lizzie Gold directly in the chat or email Lizzie at lizzie.gold@thenetworkone.com. We'll be recording this webinar and we'll be sharing the slides afterwards, so there's no need to take notes if you'd prefer not to. And in the unlikely event that the system crashes, please just wait a couple of minutes and log back in via the same link that you already used to log in this afternoon. It should all be completely fine now, so don't worry about that. If you'd like to follow Sean on Twitter, his handle is @SeanPDEC. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Sean Pillot de Chenecy. Sean is a researcher, speaker, and author. With a background as an independent strategist, Sean has conducted ethnographic activity and trend research all around the world for over 20 years, gaining actionable insights for leading brands in a wide range of sectors. As a result of this, he has a very deep level of street and board level knowledge regarding the genuine issues impacting brands from a now, next, why perspective. He's also the author of 2 dynamic books, The Post-Truth Business, which focuses on trust, empathy, and ethics, whilst Influencers and Revolutionaries illuminates leading-edge innovation, behavioral change, and environmental issues. He's currently writing his 3rd book, The New Abnormal, which looks into a positive way forward for organizations and society, #after COVID. During today's webinar, he'll discuss the findings of his books from the perspective of the effects on brand marcoms in general, and the implications for leading independent agencies around the world. So without further ado, I'll now turn over to Sean. So let me just find Sean.
Can all hear me? Good. Yes, I've been unmuted, so that is marvellous. And hi, everyone. And I gather that the Philippines have now joined us as well, which is superb. So welcome to you, obviously. Now, as Julian and Stephanie just mentioned, what I'm going to be doing in my talk is to take you through my thinking from the perspective of my first 2 books, The Post-Truth Business and Influencers and Revolutionaries, and then in terms of where I'm going now, from the point of view of all things after COVID, which is naturally the focus of all our attention. Now, I'm entirely aware, by the way, that we've only got 35 minutes for the initial batch of this, followed by Q&A, so I will crack on, and obviously I'll put my screen on in a second from the point of view of sharing slides with you. Now, just so we're all clear on this, what I'm going to be doing is talking through my perspective on social trends, cultural trends, the issues of my 2 books, from the perspective, naturally, of how this all impacts on the independent agency networks around the world and the independent creatives and planners and strategists, in terms of certainly where I see things going and how this could be actually impacting yourselves. So with no further ado, I will now just hopefully share the screen with you so you can see what I'll be going through. So hopefully you can now see my slides. Please let me know if you cannot, Stephanie or anyone else. So here we are then. From the point of view of the 2 books, the first one, The Post-Truth Business.
Sorry, we can't see your slides yet.
You can't? Okay, let's just try that once more. Okay, how about that?
No.
Yeah, let's try once again.
Did it yesterday.
Right, I know. No, let's just do this again, because it's certainly clicking up on here. How about that? Are you clicking up? No.
Hold on.
Let's just try once more. Okay. How about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Marvelous. I was mentioning that day when I was doing an interview for the podcast with the head of global research at, as they say, one of the biggest ad agencies in the world, and they mentioned that every meeting we've all been having on the line over the last month starts with at least 10 minutes of everyone saying, "Hello, can you hear me?" or "Are you there? I can't see what you're doing." So in classic mode, we've done precisely the same thing. Okay, so just to crack on, first 2 books, The Post-Truth Business and Influencers and Revolutionaries. What I was talking about in the first one was naturally this issue of the fact that, to state the staggeringly obvious, all relationships are built on trust. So that's the relationship that you have in your own personal life with those around you, and naturally it's the relationship that consumers have with brands, and indeed that you have with your clients. And so this issue of trust and transparency, of acting in an ethical way, are issues that have become, I think, ever more apparent over the last couple of years. Certainly when we look at, let's say, titles like The Economist, they will say very, very clearly that, you know, consumer trust is the basis of all brand values, and that's why businesses have an immense incentive to retain it. What I frame that around in the first book is what I term then reputation capital, as in our brands, or indeed products, or indeed politicians, or those around us, meeting effectively three issues. Are they trustworthy, reliable, and competent? And that issue, again, of trustworthiness, I'll go through in more detail in a second, but from the point of view of us living now in a world of mistrust that is full of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, alternative facts, etc., I think this issue is becoming ever more important and ever more integral to where we are. We're seeing today the amount of fake news and misinformation put out into the public realm, online or offline, with regards to fake news around COVID-19 is obviously appalling, but it's just adding to the sense of what Francis Fukuyama spoke about so long ago in terms of, you know, the FUD factor: fear, uncertainty, and doubt. In terms of where we are now, I think until a couple of years ago, when you were talking to any futurist, when you're looking at people talking around the future of the city, one of the points I think we came back to time and time again in endless reports from agencies on the comms side, on the planning side, on the research side, etc., whether you went to via think tanks or media reports, the future of the city argument seemed to be falling, I think, into one of two spheres. One was the future city as a hive. The other was this issue of the future city as a wasteland. Meanwhile, how things sit now from the point of view of COVID-19 and the current city and the future city and the implications on that from the point of view of, you know, social trends and cultural trends, I think we're falling into, and how this impacts on industry is one of two arguments, or one of two debates, should we say. One is everything's changed, and the other is nothing's changed. I think the nothing's changed argument seems to be coming to us from a Mark Ritson type point of view, whereas then everything's changed is coming from, the bulk of comms world, whereby we're seeing only, I think yesterday, Unilever stating that they're anticipating that serious consumer change is now going to be permanent, and they're adapting their plans accordingly. In terms of the amount of information that's being put out there that is reliable and believable and usable and actionable by people like yourselves working independently for independent outfits around the world. Again, I think what we're seeing now is so much information that's being put into the public realm that we're having to naturally take a call on it. Because there is no rock solid ground to go down, because no one's been here before, there obviously is no effective, genuinely useful, rock solid data. But what we can, I believe, you know, say that we can say hand on heart that we actually know is going to happen in terms of cultural trends, social trends, tomorrow's consumer. That issue of, is, I think a lot of reports have put it, is that tomorrow's consumer is clearly going to be poorer from the perspective of the forthcoming downturn, the even greater downturn, possibly turning into, obviously, into a depression. So they're going to be poorer, they're going to be nervous, which links again to Francis Fukuyama's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. They're going to be obsessed with social distancing and hygiene. And we're seeing how that is already impacting on certain sectors as they reopen. And we know that this issue of social distancing is naturally going to hugely impact on the hospitality sector. If you're running a hotel, a restaurant, a bar, if you're in the travel business, etc., if you're running an office in any sector, then the issue of social distancing naturally is going to have an astonishing impact for certainly the medium, if not long-term future. So I think what we can certainly agree is that in many sectors, in many areas, there isn't going to be a return to normal, inverted commas. So what are we doing? I think this issue, and I'll go through this naturally quickly due to the time we have, this issue of where we all are now And again, as Julian was saying at the beginning, in terms of the amount of people who are joining this webinar around the world, what are we all doing as we all sit here listening in or watching in? We're going through that pause, reset, reframe, sort of relaunch aspect. Doesn't matter what we're doing, doesn't matter what part of the marketing sector or spheres we're working within, we're all, I think, as we're sitting here right now, going through that process. In terms of what are the brands that are actually doing something useful at the moment, how are they linking into what the public actually wants in terms of that, if you say that B corporation, be the change point of view. I put 3 down there that links to my first book. The first one, very briefly, is what I would really describe as a brand taking a lead from Aristotle. I did give a lot of my talks via philosophers and art. So Aristotle, from the point of view of a brand taking an authentic point of view, I use the brand that everyone uses in every talk, which is who are the wonderful Patagonia. And I think what we saw, for instance, with the Election Day campaign, that again, people rightly praise Patagonia for, was when Patagonia shut down the stores to allow people, or to encourage people to, rather than shop, to go and actually use their vote. And that was taking, I think, that Aristotelian perspective, which was, as Aristotle put it, the virtuous person does virtuous things for virtuous reasons, not for public gain. As in, we help the old person over the road while social distancing without Instagramming ourselves while we're doing it. So that point of view of Patagonia doing something that was the right thing to do, I think does take an Aristotle sort of angle. Nike, when they did the Colin Kaepernick campaign that so rightly won plaudits a couple of years ago, I think took a sort of a lead from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, obviously the political philosopher, who spoke about from his point of view that we were most in touch with ourselves when we did things that linked to our passions, that we just felt to be right, that we didn't over-rationalize them. In that perspective, perhaps Nike, weren't allowing themselves to be sidetracked; they just did the right thing. And then finally, I've mentioned in terms of a sort of a philosophical angle to this, the Mighty Toms, a brand that was very, very high profile a couple of years ago, perhaps slightly gone off the scale now, in terms of their one-for-one business model that's been utilized and copied everywhere. I think that was really taking a Nietzschean perspective in terms of viewing oneself as he did as a work in progress, as an iterative thing, perhaps as an innovative idea of how one should frame a brand in terms of what they were doing, say, with their one-for-one business model, whereby the act of consumption becomes an act that helps someone else. So this, I think, is being shown now by brands here like Melita. We're seeing endless examples of brands standing up to be counted, brands showing their integrity, showing their point of view, showing, dare I say it, their purpose, that dreadful word that we've all been banging on about for years, which is usually used in an incredibly weak, sort of almost hypocritical way. But I think brands linking with competitors, brands doing things for the public good, brands reframing and retooling factories, re-evaluating what they do, is something that can be done just as much by a manufacturing brand as it can be done by people like yourselves working in the independent sector throughout the world. So from the point of view of could and should you be linking up with those who only a few weeks ago you'd have considered to be your competitors, what it is that you can be doing now to actually use the skills you have for the public good, for the social good, for the community good. I think absolutely integral. So I ended up very briefly on that book with Manifesto. Reason being, all journalists love manifestos and they're also very easy to give talks about. And so I think there, I just linked into those issues about what did it mean to really be a genuine, authentic brand. I put them under those brackets. So, in terms of, be authentic, act transparently, have empathy, respect privacy, and behave ethically. The world's most obvious manifesto. But to me, what was fascinating out of that was 2 things, very briefly. One, everyone has talked about authenticity for years, certainly since I joined the industry years ago. Very few people actually stop and explain what authenticity means. And then I think the other crucial thing of that list is empathy. Iris Murdoch, the philosopher, really picked up those have gone before, people like sort of Sartre, etc., Nietzsche and others, Kierkegaard, who spoke from a sort of existentialist point of view, and she was saying that if you become too self-obsessed, which I think a lot of brands who are self-referencing and trying to be overly authentic are, you can become almost nihilistic. And so she said you had to have empathy, you had to consider those around you without becoming too inner focused. I think that's a crucial point, and we're seeing now this issue of empathy becoming absolutely fundamental to where we stand today, you know, in April 2020, in terms of, you know, how we should be acting. Moving swiftly on in terms of the time we have, here's something I think that really links into, no doubt, most of you out there, wherever you are around the world, and the many countries that Julian read out earlier on, you know, so from that point of view, I've put in here, obviously a great image. And so the idea here of Matisse, you know, so Matisse being someone that perhaps many outsiders like yourselves, many independents like yourselves could relate to. There's someone who had been independent throughout his life, who had spent most of his life being ridiculed, being shamed. What he was doing was literally laughed at. And how did we see someone like that who became so influential, dare I say it, so revolutionary, effectively changing what he was doing, taking information and copying those around him, you know, linking up with them, being generous to them, having generosity in return, passing it forward, as they say. You know, what did he do? He basically collaborated, and by collaboration improved, and was absolutely sort of, you know, superb as a result. How did he do it? By linking up with the artist John Russell, who painted with Monet. I think a crucial point for him was travel and collaboration with colleagues, so linking up with those like Albert Marquet, linking up with André Derain, having a trip to Corsica that was absolutely astonishing and totally impacted his life from the point of view of colour. Went off to Collier with a mission to reinvent. And this issue of reinvention now, today, in April 2020, in a C90 environment is huge. He said, everything must be created, renewed. And I'm sure that there's a ton of you out there who are absolutely considering creating everything anew. You know, having stopped, having paused, having refreshed your own thinking, realizing that we've got to start again. So, you know, what do they do? Very briefly, they used an example of something that I spoke about at the last live event I did. Seems ages ago, a few weeks ago, when we were allowed to mix with others. The superb magazine Contagious, that no doubt you all get, spoke or utilized an old Arthur Schopenhauer quote, which is used by planners and strategists and researchers endlessly. That great one that says, the problem is not to see what nobody has yet seen, as to think what nobody's yet thought concerning that which everybody sees. Now, in today's environment, when we are all stuck at home, going crazy, prisoners of our environment, but then also finding a lot of satisfaction from that, linking with our neighbours, with our communities, with our families and friends, I think that issue of trying to to see through what's happening now, to consider things afresh, are huge. It's worth noting that after after Matisse came back from Collier, he was ridiculed again, and their use of art and their use of light and colour was thought to be absolutely insane, but it enabled him to refresh his own creativity, and basically he was termed a wild beast as a result of doing so, throwing paint in the eyes of the public. What are we seeing that being taken to the present day? What, another 10 minutes to go. That issue of, as Extinction Rebellion last year put it, you know, XR, the most impactful, vibrant, effective pressure group of our era, who had taken on board the most impressive, powerful, effective protests globally, and had basically utilized the best bits of them for the public good, have also come back in terms of their the pressure they're putting on society and governments to do something about the climate crisis and the ecological emergency. Something they're also doing, obviously, is pointing the finger squarely at people like us, in terms of those of us who work in and around, as they would put it, the multi-billion-dollar persuasion machine. So that issue of us all having now to stand up and be counted, There's no sitting on the fence here. If we think C19 is bad, then we need to, again, reframe our thinking and just remind ourselves how appalling the issue is globally of, I say, the climate crisis and the ecological emergency. And as those who are charged with superpowering capitalism, every one of us in any perspective of the comms world has to be considering what actions are we taking to do things for the public good with regards to this, the most crucial question of our time. Bigger, absolutely, than the COVID-19 issue. And again, this is something I really sort of focus on in my second book. And what I do there is also to talk about people who are genuinely either influential and revolutionary, as I mentioned earlier on, from the point of view of artists. The wonderful Greta Thunberg, who I put in the book when I wrote it last year, and the book came out last month or month before, was the fact that perhaps if we'd all been thinking about naming someone who is influential and revolutionary in from the point of view of culture, society, and business, then perhaps a couple of years ago we might have thought about Elon Musk and Tesla, who basically created a radical new range of consumer products, and in doing so made better things. I think now a genuine revolutionary, the most revolutionary person of our time, I believe, is Greta Thunberg. And what has she done? Instead of just being interested in making better things, she takes a more profound approach and basically wants to make things better for humanity. And if there's anyone that we can all take genuine inspiration from, I think it is the wonderful Thunberg. Just the one other thing I'd mention in terms of that book is this, the idea that is bubbling under. I wrote about it a couple of years ago, and my first book, I wrote about it again recently, this issue of surveillance capitalism and the issue of privacy and tracking is now, as we all know, becoming center stage ever more because of the issue of us all, no doubt very soon, being required to have tracking technology, or even more tracking technology, put onto our phones, etc., in order that we can be tracked as members of society from the point of view of C19. This again comes back to comms world, to marketing world, because again, the brands who are linking in with this are going to be promoted by people like us, and I think surveillance capitalism is going to become, again, an ever greater issue. Once privacy has gone, it's gone. And certainly if you talk to any psychologist, absolutely from a bluntly put Western perspective, they will say that privacy is something that absolutely is an integral part of our psyche, but it's fast disappearing, and we need to be doing something about it. So I'd say, along with all the thinking at the moment about C19, and all the thinking that has to be done about issues regarding the climate, we need to be absolutely considering our impact on issues around privacy. And this goes right back to things like the 2016 election with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, issues around psychographic profiling, hyper-targeting, all of those utilizing the Adlan's box of tricks are something that we are all, to a greater or lesser extent in comms world, linked in with. I think it's a really crucial thing that we think about. So again, in that book, I just put out a manifesto there, and I talked about questioning, confronting, looking and listening, research and developing, collaborating, and being a good corporate citizen. The one person I'd mentioned very briefly on that one is René Descartes. And this, I think, is, again, really important from the point of view of independent agencies or independent individuals. So if you're a strategist in a big agency or a small agency or whatever, ever more, I think we're seeing right now, when we're in an environment whereby we've all stopped and we're all pausing, we're all reframing, is we need to ask heretical questions, as Descartes did. Descartes could be called perhaps the father of innovation, because he said, how can we know this for certain? And that issue of how can we know this for certain is something that every marketeer should be asking themselves about every brand they work on. There's too much thinking, which basically says, this is how it's always been done. Consumers, inverted commas, all think this because we know that, because that's what it says here. I think there's a real case now for saying, stop, let's reconsider absolutely everything that we're doing, reframe the question, get out there, and in this, as I put it, new abnormal environment, just check that all those sacred cows that basically, you know, were they correct in the first place? You know, are we really the world's favorite airline, etc.? And so there's a great deal, I think, of hard questioning that needs to be done to reframe and rethink and refresh for the world ahead. All of that, by the way, I'm going to be banging into my new podcast, which luckily I think some of you have already agreed to be on, which is a wonderful thing. Anyone else that would like to do so, please get in touch. And what I'm framing that around are three things, which are hope, community, and resilience. I think that issue of hope is utterly, utterly vital now in terms of us all having been to this appalling, if nothing else, you know, psychological experiment over the last month. So we need something to hang on to. We need to be looking forward in a progressive way. I think we're seeing already the impact of, we're all seeing this on our TV screens, on our news sort of reports. People singing on balconies in Italy, or or sort of playing football on either sides of the street in Brazil. Those who are helping neighbours, whatever. I think this issue of, again, brands getting involved, corporates getting involved, organisations getting involved, individuals getting involved, agencies and their clients getting involved. This issue of community is ever more important. And again, one of those things that is going to really link into is this point of view of a new social contract and building resilience, because as we're seeing, if supply chains have been nailed, which are one of the three things that The Economist puts as crucial issues as we go forward in terms of how supply chains are going to get ever more nationalistic and regionalistic, then building resilience into each one of ours businesses, be that either they be run by absolutely the individual or by the small collective, is something that I think is ever more important. Last couple of slides, I think, just again to sort of wrap that up again from the point of view of pointers for independent agencies and operators, is this you know, and again, where we are now, C.S. Lewis, that great quote that C.S. Lewis had, which was, you know, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. I think that is something that we, again, all need to be really thinking about. I've been, as we all have, no doubt, I've been reading everything in order to get going with my sort of podcast and writings. And that issue of, I think, too many people are still expecting some sort of bridge to go back to where we were. I think it's becoming ever more important and apparent. That bridge is burnt, it's gone. We are moving ahead into a new abnormal world. And as Matisse put it, by the way, in terms of perhaps being trapped by the past or being trapped by accepted ways of doing things. You know, he said, an artist must never be a prisoner of style, of reputation, or of success. So no matter where you were only 2 months ago, take the positives, take the things that were working, realize that just like every business in the world, every organization in the world, every society in the world, there was lots that was wrong, and discard those and move on with, I think, the positive. So last couple of slides, here we go. The great Kate Tempest. I'm sure you've all seen the great new work from Droga 5 for Facebook. Facebook, one of my most loathed brands, the anti-social network, but the fantastic work that was done by Droga 5, I think, is great when they use a Kate Tempest track for that. And as she says in it, you know, that wonderful line from her poem People's Faces that they use is was that a pivotal historical moment we just went stumbling past? I think she's so staggeringly eloquent and angry and energetic, and she's such an influential, incentivizing person, perhaps a true revolutionary of our time. Another great quote I love from Kate Tempest, when she tries to make sense of the world, which she does so well, she says, "I witness the world by paying attention." I think that is a great line that one began to sort of finish off on. So last slide is this. Again, one of the points that she'll make is this, that a feeling of unfairness is a terrible thing. I reckon that everyone in on this webinar is feeling that life has dealt them a very unfair hand. All those plans we all had until very recently are in many cases up in flames. You know, client relationships perhaps have broken down, contracts have gone, projects have been cancelled. It's all change. If you're in certain sectors, it's all over. In others, actually, it's gone fairly well. But that issue of unfairness is an incredibly powerful but negative emotion. I think we need to get out of it. As the great John Elkington, the environmental writer, puts it in his new book, Green Swans, let's take black swans and turn them green. So let's take something that has basically smashed all of our lives and basically, from his point of view, reframe that around what he terms the coming boom in regenerative capitalism. Capitalism clearly wasn't working. Comms world that we all work in terms of those who are listening to this and watching this webinar today, was a real driver of that capitalist system. So let's make sure we are absolutely on board with where it's going on next. So from the point of view of the Network One, the wonderful Network One and the fantastic network of independent agencies and operators out there, I think to finish off, as they say, we're stronger together. So Julian and Stephanie, back to you.
Thank you very much. That was great. So I'm just going to open up the room for Q&A. We've had one question from someone in the chat, and they've said, Sean mentioned Melita. What are they doing that's good at the moment?
Okay, so Melita, basically what they're doing is that they're a maker of coffee filters and vacuum bags. Welcome to be not the world's most interesting area. However, what they've been doing is retooling the factory to make coffee filters, which are essentially, as we all know, that shape, and turning them into things that basically can be used as masks for health workers or indeed for the general public. So there's a classic example of a brand that had, in many cases, nothing to do with the world we are now, or the problem we're now facing, and by clever thinking and by looking at what they're doing in an oblique way and an innovative way, have retooled and gone to do something for the public good. I say when this, not that we're going to get to one day when C19 officially stops, because I think we're all agreed it's going to be with us for a long time, but certainly increasingly, I'm no doubt we can all agree, increasingly consumers, people are going to be saying, what did you do during the crisis?
Absolutely. We've got another question in, and they've said, will this SARS-CoV-2 emergency lead to changes in how we are able to price our comms products and solutions away from time and material cost versus the value of the work idea? Work or slash idea.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point, because this issue of, I think it certainly will, and why? I think it's because effectively we're all making it up as we go along. Because there is no hard data to fall back on, because it doesn't matter if you're running General Motors or British Airways or the local coffee shop or a local beer brand or whatever, or a fast food chain, everyone now needs clever thinking, clear ideas, a viewpoint on where it's all going. So I think the value of ideas, the value of sharp thinking is going to be ever more important now. And this, I think, comes back to, I believe, one of the points that I think actually Julian made in the latest great report for the the independent agencies 2020, when he's talking about global agency networks are neither well designed for original thinking, nor are they particularly well designed for local customization. What can we all agree on when we're going to be seeing more and more activity taking place on a national or even regional basis from a branding perspective? We're going to be needing, or should we say clients are going to be needing, smart original thinking and a local perspective. That is where the megacorp is, I think, really badly placed in comms world. It is where the independent, sharp thinking, creatively excellent agency is very, very well positioned. So I think there are naturally going to be, difficult to say, but positive things coming out of this appalling crisis. One of them is, in this context, it's going to benefit independence, because clients need independent thinking and independent, relevant, creative, I think, more than ever.
Great, thank you very much. Someone else in the chat has said, I concur that it's best to not try to go backwards to before, but don't you believe that many brands will look to engage consumers with halcyon promises of being able to recapture their past experiences?
I think this issue of a halcyon past or halcyon past is very comforting, because in an incredible, what we all know, talk to any psychologist and they will tell you, in a time of stress and worry, people will go to safe ground. This is why I mentioned Francis Fukuyama, the superb Japanese-American writer, and obviously lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, who's written, naturally, you all know, several books. One, The End of Capitalism, or The End of History, didn't go too well, but certainly The Great Disruption did, way back in 2001. And again, I think he made the point really clearly there, that when, as you saw it then, when we were confronted by, as you put it, the FUD factor, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, people will go quite naturally to an area where they feel comfortable. And the past, if your past is a happy one or was a happy one, is comfortable. So there'll be a lot of nostalgia, and there's not, and nostalgia can be just as innovative as being, if we say, forward-looking. There's plenty that is progressive and creative and innovative that can be found in the past. So I think there'll be, a lot of nostalgic imagery put out. There'll be a lot of nostalgic stories put out there. Brands will certainly hark back to solid times based in a more sort of a firm-footed environment. But again, they will have to reflect the reality that people see around them, which will be different, clearly.
Great, thanks. We've got someone, Steve Hastings, in the chat would like to ask a question. So I'm just going to unmute Steve. Hopefully you're there.
I've unmuted myself. Is that okay?
There we go. Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for a very, very inspirational speech. And all it lacked was a round of applause afterwards, which we can't give you. I love the idea that a brand must not be a prisoner. Absolutely agree with that. And I wonder, just to put you on the spot really, can you think of name one big brand which you think is likely to be stuck in the past, and perhaps one large brand that you think is reacting and moving well to the new abnormal?
Crikey, good question. I'd say to slightly sidestep early days, because natural brands only now reframe themselves. I think interestingly enough, the whole sector that has dealt with this the best so far, I think many can agree with, is financial services. So go back to the last terrible issue of the downturn, that we all quite naturally hang on to the banks. Basically, they caused it and got away with it, and we paid the price in terms of the public. Now, and this has been very much led on a governmental basis, where I think essentially governments have called in the heads of banks, put a gun to their head and said, you lot are going to take the hit on this, so basically stand up to be counted, but they have done. So I think we would have seen globally, if they hadn't been doing things to support the public, to support businesses of many types, then we would have seen even more now a cataclysmic collapse of economies around the world. Instead, the banks actually at the moment, I think, are doing well. In terms of those who are doing badly, I mean, the one to me that really stands out as having had a car crash of a downturn, should we say, or of C-19, is Virgin.
Yeah.
Richard Branson, that has spent his life appearing to be the people's friend because he has a beard, I think his standing, if you were head of PR for Virgin now, I think either you would be sort of, drinking heavily while sobbing and hiding under your bed, or certainly looking for a new job, because that brand, I think, has acted, should we say, unimpressively, to put it very politely.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Steve. We have another question from Will Collin. So let me just unmute Will, if you're there, Will.
Hi, yeah, can you hear?
Yes, perfectly, thank you.
Hi. So my question is picking up on something that Rory Sutherland recently said, where he made the observation that a lot of existing categories are essentially supported by mass copying, mass consumer behaviors where people model themselves on those around them. And so if it's fashion or if it's travel, we behave in a certain way and buy the things we do because it's the thing that everybody does. And yet, you know, as so many of those normal assumptions have been swept aside, can we assume that people will return to doing what they always did? Or are, in fact, we're going to see some wholesale changes where those previously mass behaviors aren't returned, and so certain categories do shrink massively, possibly to be replaced by others? I don't know if you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, again, great question. The great Rory Sutherland, he's out there somewhere wearing his tweed suit, no doubt. I'm sure he'll refuse to back down and sort of dress down. Okay, so I gave a talk a month or so ago at M&C Saatchi, and lots of the London planners were there from different agencies at a Cultural Insights Forum. And I think one of the points that we were talking about there was, we're social animals. And what was, I think, really fascinating there, I was talking about an interview I did with Martin Raymond at the Future Laboratory. Martin Raymond, I think, is one of the great futurists in the world. I mean, a real futurist, not just someone who has a sort of funny haircut. And so his point about advertising, and this is a while ago, was advertising that was essentially built on moments of self-doubt, essentially making us think that I want to be like the person next door or whatever, who's got a slightly more interesting car or interesting haircut or interesting clothes or whatever. Advertising has now become, in a social sense, almost, or in a political sense, a socialist movement. It's interesting how the ultimate capitalist driver, advertising, has been promoting moments of community, has been promoting, again, a we culture rather than an obsessive I culture. And this move from me to we, I think, is really, really fascinating. So there will still naturally be loads of consumer drivers that will never change. Yeah, we all like to look good. We all like to sound interesting. If you gave me the chance of having a nicer car than my neighbor, I may well say, yes, please. But that issue, I think, in terms of, as I mentioned earlier on, it's too early to tell how many areas of consumer behavior will change because we're only just starting this. But that issue that we have just seen globally take off, which is a rising sense of empathy with those around us, with friends looking after friends. I'm sure we've all, checked in on friends in a way that, quite frankly, we hadn't before, particularly men who have always been very bad at doing this. We have looked after neighbours as we've never done before, certainly in the Western world, where we have a far more sort of isolated culture. So that issue of also linking into, or more and more people realizing, say, issues around the environment and attitudes towards animals. We've all been watching, almost as soon as this thing started, the imagery of dolphins swimming around in Venice Harbour. Yesterday, pelicans walking down the Mall in London. In India, people able to see the Himalayas because the smog has lifted. Same thing in Beijing. Same thing in Los Angeles. There's a lot that will change because people don't want to go back to where we were. In some areas they do, but there's lots that I think we're now all agreeing was clearly wrong, and we don't want to go back there.
Sorry. We've got time for 3 more quick questions. I'm just going to pass over to Massimiliano, who'd like to ask one. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
Oh, nice headphones.
Hi. Thank you, Sean, for your speech. Quite interesting. I would like to ask you a question. You say that we don't have data about something as big as is going on, as is happening right now. Okay. But do you think there's something to be learned from the crisis of the past? I don't know, like the 9/11 attacks or the big earthquakes or something like that. On a smaller scale, of course, but still interesting.
Oh, certainly. I think certainly that point about looking, we have to look somewhere to try and make sense of where we are now, clearly. And naturally the major economic downturn that happened, obviously 2008. I remember when I was in New York on the day when Bear Stearns, the bank, went down. I was staying in a hotel very near to that bank. We can look to that to see how consumers changed their behavior when essentially public services were being nailed, whereby the jobs market was constricting, whereby salaries were flatlining. We can see clear consumer changes that took effect or that were affected by that. We can certainly look back to 9/11 and see the sense of shock that hit societies around the world, and which brands did better initially as a result. And to link to one of the earlier questions, we saw a real rise in essentially nostalgic based brands from our childhood, brands that as all of us sit here today watching in or listening in, brands that our mothers used to give us. In Italy, no doubt, people were linking into sort of a Nutella or whatever it is. So that issue of us looking to the past to take comfort in brands that we remember from our childhood were in many cases absolutely brands that did very, very well as a result. To me, I think one of the most interesting areas we have to look at now is maker culture. So if we're going to be seeing, say, more and more national supply chains springing up, more and more local manufacturing re-emerging, then the links to the appreciation of the respect for local makers, local artisans, people who we can also locally trust because we can know and see them. We can almost touch the maker at the farmer's market or whatever. I think that's going to be a real growth area. So The Economist says that, one of the three big things, apart from supply chains constricting and tech taking off ever more, is going to be the growth of if you like, of the oligarchy brands. So, the mega brands will just become bigger and bigger and bigger. There will be an ever more destruction of the mid-sized brands. But I think the other side we're going to see is a real springboard for the very, very local maker brands, the artisans, because again, in many cases, they're the ones that we see around us. They are of our communities. So those, I think, are the ones that in this time of fear, uncertainty and doubt, as Fukuyama put it, will do well.
Great, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but just to wrap up, I will just quickly say a big thank you to you for that great session. Really, really interesting. And if you didn't have a chance to ask your question, but you'd still like to, you can contact Sean either on Twitter, which is @SeanPDEC, or via his email address, which is sean@brandpositive.org. So hopefully you can see my screen there, and you can find the details there. Yeah, thank you all for coming, and sincere apologies about any technical difficulties you might have had at the beginning. This is our first time doing this. I hope you'll show us some mercy. And we will be coming back next week for another webinar. We'll actually be holding them at the same time every Wednesday. So the next one will be held on May the 6th, called Leading Agencies Through a Crisis, and that'll be with Elise Mitchell. So Elise is from Nashville, Tennessee, and she's a 3-time successful agency CEO and former president of the International Communications Consultancies Organization. So she'll be talking about lessons that we all need now. She's an electric presenter who's really walked the talk. So future webinar Wednesdays can be found on our website under events at www.thenetwork1.com/webinars. Thank you all very, very much for participating, and have a great day.